He was driving home. They thought he was a criminal. Rain stitched silver along the boulevard, each streetlight smearing the night into an impressionist painting. A long black sedan cut through the mist, its leather seats still carrying the warmth of the community center. A late meeting about scholarships and after-school programs. He had been there not as a visitor, but as a patron. A man who had grown up on these blocks and returned year after year to fund the basketball courts, to bargain with the city for lights, to sit in folding chairs and listen. Inside the car, Malik Carter adjusted the rearview mirror. The city had changed, but not all of it. He saw boarded windows and shuttered storefronts. He saw young men in hoodies making their way past a corner bodega. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility, the mixture of affection and frustration that comes from watching a neighborhood you love fall into patterns that take generations to undo. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2. The engine thrummed, quiet and expensive beneath him. Then headlights behind him flared blue and red. A cruiser tucked into his tail like a shark. At first, Malik thought it was routine, a late patrol keeping tabs on the strip. He signaled, pulled to the curb beneath an awning that shed only a thin halo of light, and waited. Officer Kyle Braddock stepped out of his cruiser with the kind of swagger trained on asserting dominance. Badge 5924 glinted against the spray. He carried himself like someone who had made the job his identity, a uniform as armor, an assumption as ordnance. "License and registration," Braddock said, voice flat as a slab. Malik reached for his wallet. His hands were steady, practiced. "Officer, I'm—" "Cut the crap," Braddock snapped. "We've had reports. This block. You fit the description." There was a young officer at Braddock's shoulder, Ben O'Malley, eyes flicking between Malik and his partner like someone listening for a sign. Ben had 10 months on the force and maybe too much conscience to drown. He shifted his weight and watched the exchange, a bystander to the escalation. Malik handed over his documents. He didn't flinch when Braddock leaned in toward the open window and sniffed, theatrically, as if searching for a scent that made guilt official. "How you smell that?" Braddock asked. He asked, but he didn't have to. The theater did its work alone. It was the smell that becomes probable cause in the hands of an officer who needs nothing more. "Marijuana. You got anything in the car?" Malik laughed, short, incredulous. "Officer, my car's a mobile office. You smell coffee and leather. I haven't—" "Spread your hands on the hood," Braddock said. The command landed like a verdict. Malik put his palms down. He could have pointed out that he was an investor, a civic donor, a name that appeared on plaques. He could have said, "Look at this coat, look at these keys, check my ID." He could have asked them to run his records and find every filing of his corporation, the non-profits, the tax returns, that underpinned how he came to own the house 3 blocks down. He didn't. Maybe that would have read as pleading, or maybe he knew the world in that instant. Status makes a dent in other people's expectations, but it doesn't erase the instinct to see danger first when the color of skin matches a stereotype. Braddock's patience had the texture of a practiced ritual. He frisked Malik with the casual contempt of a man who had decided the story. His fingers found nothing. He asked again for consent to look through the car. Malik said no. The word no did not matter the night it arrived from the lips of a black man. "Step out of the vehicle," Braddock ordered. A crowd had gathered, 2 or 3 people from the block. A woman leaning out of a second-story window with a phone. The bodega kid who'd seen Malik as a boy with scraped knees, now watching his name and face pass through the lens of someone else's judgment. Someone tapped record. A dash cam word. "Who are you?" Braddock demanded, as he jammed the car door open. "Malik Carter," he said. The syllables of his name carried weight in the neighborhood. A tech entrepreneur who had built a company and kept his feet on these streets. A man who had donated money to a scholarship fund in his mother's name. "I just left the community center." Braddock looked at him like the name was a joke. "You're coming with us," he said. They put him in cuffs. The metal made a bright clink that sounded grotesquely loud against the wet night. Hand over hand, they hauled him to the cruiser. Ben's face hardened at the edges, as if he had been scraped by the thought of doing the wrong thing for the right reason. Braddock read a line from some internal ledger of authority. "You're under arrest for possession." There was no paraphernalia, no foil, no bag. Nothing. Braddock wrote the tale in the air. The smell, the evasive answers, the puff of rationalization that fills the silence. He lied with the calmness of someone telling a story he's told 100 times and expects will be believed. Malik's phone was still in his jacket pocket. He remembered to press record. He had learned to record. Years of being policed taught him how to create a paper trail from pixels. He filmed the dashcam's timestamp, the badge number close up, and the officer leaning toward the camera. His posture designed for a still photograph. Authority, unchallenged. When they booked him, the precinct smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm. A desk sergeant, Miller, the desk sergeant's nameplate read, barked for paperwork. Malik's jacket was tossed on a chair with the kind of casual disregard that pretends regulation is the same as respect. An officer joked about big shots as he thumbed through a form. They led him to a holding cell that hummed with the mundane cruelty of the system. It was a narrow rectangle, cold and damp, with a narrow bench bolted to the wall. He sat and listened to the sounds of other people's nights. There was a man 2 cells down, coughing like the city itself, another muttering to himself about a missed court date. The hum of fluorescent light became a chorus. In the cell, a man named Cassidy, a petite, wiry man with dates tattooed along his knuckles, leaned across the bars to spit a few words. Cassidy had a way of talking that kept to facts and didn't add salt. He asked Malik where he was from. Then, with the bluntness of neighborhood knowledge, he said, "You shouldn't be here, man, not you." Malik folded his hands and let the initial sting fade into a cleaner feeling. Anger turned to clarity. Rage had a way of clouding judgment, but clarity offered levers. The story of his public life had never been about passivity. He had built companies that mobilized capital. He had put his name on fundraising letters and on the side of a building where a plaque hummed with donors' names. He knew how contracts lined up, how boardrooms leaned on city councils, and how press conferences moved reputations. He sat and counted his options. He could sue. He could shout. He could tweet and let the indignation spread. He could, like 100 other men before him, light up the corner with righteous fury. But what he wanted, what the night revealed, was something more exacting. It would hurt the system in a way that had consequences for the people who abused it. It would not be spectacle. It would be strategy. At 2:14 a.m. he placed a call. Sarah Jenkins answered on the second ring. She had been his counsel for a previous corporate negotiation, an attorney who moved through adversarial rooms with the patience of a chess player. The connection clicked tight as Malik explained, each word delivered with the economy of someone who had been vetted by the night. "They took me," he said. "Braddock, badge 5924. He arrested me for possession. There was nothing." "Did you record?" Sarah asked, the professional tone already assembling a checklist. "Dash cam. Someone from the corner had their phone out. I started recording once he cuffed me. Preserve everything. Don't delete anything. Text me whatever you have. Do not consent to any searches. I'm on my way." They were a well-practiced pair, not because they'd rehearsed injustice, but because they knew the mechanics of undoing it. Sarah told him what to do and what not to do. The public record requests, the early letter before suit, the preservation demands. She spoke in the language of procedure, not vengeance. She was a scalpel. By morning, video clips had leaked to feeds. The dashcam showed Braddock leaning into the driver's window, sniffing, and then ordering Malik out. A bystander's vertical clip captured the handcuffs, and Malik's name being called to the air like an accusation. Within hours, the clip looped across platforms. Twitter threads mapped the sequence. Profanity from the officer, the wet sheen of the street, Malik's jacket slung over a chair. The mayor's office issued a statement that sounded like a reflex. "We will review the incident." The police chief read from a script that resembled concern. The first phrase from the union rep, Sergeant Kowalski, had the protective edge of someone guarding the house. Officers follow procedure. But the optics were raw. Malik's face, a well-known face in certain circles, but hardly the face that gets tapped for sympathy in the typical narratives of policing, became a node where stories converged. He had the money, yes. But he also had what money alone could not buy. His name belonged to this neighborhood. There were mothers who knew him, kids who'd received scholarships because of him, and older men who'd watched him return and call the block his home, even after his corporation headquarters moved downtown. People remember what you've done when you show up. And because he had shown up for decades, they did not see his arrest as an abstract exchange between civic actors. They saw it as a front. Within 24 hours, a thin blue line frayed. The clip had forced the administration to acknowledge the possibility that the stop had been tainted. Internal Affairs opened a file. Detective Reynolds, the one who understood the seam between what officers did in dark corners and how those moments showed up on paper, pulled records and began to look for patterns. The city's legal shop briefed counsel. The mayor's press secretary reached out to Malik's representative asking for a meeting, language designed to cushion a crisis rather than confront it. But Malik wasn't satisfied with meetings that smoothed edges. He was thinking about leverage. The law offers remedies, but law alone is slow. Legal action could extract damages, clear his name, and perhaps get a civil judgment. But the point he wanted to make was about the structural architecture that allowed a single officer to convert a routine stop into a humiliating arrest. He wanted to change the calculus that made an officer's assumption into policy. He wanted consequence. He thought about the building at 4th and Pine, the precinct's squat brick rectangle, a municipal footprint that had taken root in the middle of the neighborhood decades earlier. It sat like a tumor in a line of storefronts, a fortress whose windows rarely smiled. The park across the street had a monkey bar set rusting into uneven ground. If he could make the precinct's continued presence there a liability rather than a normality, maybe the department would have to rethink how it did business in communities that felt like home to him. He did not intend to bribe anyone. He abhorred that tactic. His plan would not coerce, threaten, or buy silence. It would use the very mechanics of public life, finance, property, negotiation, and civic oversight to create a new reality. If you own the block that supports a facility, you have negotiation power. Public agencies rarely own all of the real estate they occupy. They lease, they build, they adapt. A private investor with community credibility could, through legitimate purchase or philanthropic endowment, propose a plan to replace a precinct with a different form of civic infrastructure, a community accountability center with civilian oversight, with shared management and transparency measures written into the deed. He already had teams who knew how to move quickly, real estate executives who could identify parcel ownership, municipal attorneys who spoke the comfortable language of settlement and transfer, civic planners who could draft proposals for oversight. He had trust funds. He had a board of directors who owed him for years of stewardship. He had, most importantly, the neighborhood's trust, which could turn a private transaction into a political force. He called his real estate advisor, his philanthropy director, and Sarah. Find out if the precinct owns the building outright, he told them. If it's city property, find out the parcels adjacent. What would it take to buy the block? If we can't buy the building, what leverage can we create with an independent trust to demand oversight? Draft a memorandum of options. At the precinct, Braddock's containment worked like a ritual meant to erase the particularities of the man he detained. He wrote in his incident report about odor and non-compliance. It was a familiar narrative move: grab a cause, tie it to a crime, and anchor the story with an arrest. But the footage had unstitched those threads. The public reaction created an evidentiary pressure the internal ledger couldn't absorb. It wasn't only about whether Malik had been searched or whether evidence was found. It was now about whether a police officer had used his authority as a cudgel against a citizen because of implicit bias. In the days after, reporters began to line up at the precinct entrance. They honed their questions into single, insistent requests. Why Malik Carter? Why here? They asked about prior complaints against Braddock. The union would stand behind its member. That's the union's job. But a union can only carry so much heat when the public begins to demand accountability. Already whispers circulated about other stops Braddock had been involved in, short clips of traffic pulls that felt eerily similar in cadence, the sniffing, the casual discovery, the accelerated use of force. There was a man in a neighboring precinct who had been stopped and humiliated by Braddock a year earlier. He had not recorded the exchange, but there were phone calls and a faded complaint. Malik's legal team filed preservation orders. They demanded the release of dashcam footage, radio logs, and personnel files. They sent letters to the city council: preserve evidence, Do not destroy video. Do not screw up the chain of custody. These were the mundane rhythms of legal strategy, the parts of justice that required more patience than passion. They prevented the quick erasure of a night. And, crucially, Malik's team began to make moves in the property world. The first task was reconnaissance. If the precinct owned the lot, they needed to know the city's willingness to dissolve that parcel into public-private partnership. If the city owned the property outright, there would be procedures, public hearings, negotiations, council votes. Malik preferred transparency. He wanted a path that would be defensible not only in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. To buy a building wasn't to hide a problem. It was to transform a place of policing into a place of healing and oversight, run in consultation with residents and independent auditors. He anticipated the predictable objections. The police union would fight any suggestion that their house be sold or restructured because that threatened precedent. The chief would claim operational necessity. The mayor would hedge between holding the line and holding his political future. Malik intended to create pressure that was both legal and civic. Public meetings with council members who had been his allies, op-eds in local papers, and carefully released video that allowed people to witness what had happened without sensation corrupting the substance. Behind the scenes, Sarah began to draft the architecture of a deal that would be palatable to municipal actors. A trust formation could be proposed, a non-profit oversight body, endowed with funds to manage community programming on the parcel, to fund a transparency office, and to require certain standards of reporting from the precinct. If the precinct were to remain at the site, the trust could insist on co-management, civilian review panels with real authority, and independent auditors with subpoena power. If the city were unwilling, they could alternatively buy adjacent parcels and create a civic campus whose economic and logistical realities made a precinct's continued occupation inefficient. It was pressure applied through legitimate market dynamics and civic planning rather than through threats. This was not a plan built on malice. It was a plan calculated to force institutional adaptation. Malik did not crave the officer's ruin for its own sake. He wanted systemic change. He wanted to transform an incident into policy, to make sure an arrest like his did not happen again to someone without his resources. He wanted accountability that would outlast headlines. Braddock, for his part, doubled down. He offered a statement to a local blog. "Officers have a hard job," the quote read. "We make split-second decisions to protect the public." His union lawyer circulated a memo about procedure and the dangers of making judgments based on viral clips. Inside the department, defenders gathered around the idea that one clip could not overturn an entire record. The department's instinct was to protect its own, to preserve morale. That instinct collides painfully with public demand for examination when there is credible evidence of misconduct. Malik watched the statements with a kind of detached calculation. He understood public relations as another battlefield. He could litigate, but he could also set the tempo of the narrative. He put a plan into motion. Engage community leaders who would stand with him in public forums, line up journalists who had been through these cycles before and who understood what sustained coverage looked like, and prepare a civil suit that would be filed if the city failed to act. He did not want to ruin a career, he wanted reform, but he also knew that without risk of career consequences for officer behavior, reform tends to be cosmetic. In the early days, Sarah insisted on a methodical approach. "We do this by the book, Malik," she told him over a conference call, while the city buzzed with speculation. "We preserve, we document, we file, we let evidence tell its story, and we start the civic process in parallel. The building is leverage, not a weapon. We have to be credible." He liked that phrase, leverage, not weapon. It fit the way he saw his resources, as instruments for shaping institutions. He had spent 20 years building capital and influence, not so he could erase an insult, but so he could rewrite a system that made such insults possible. By the end of the week, he authorized a preliminary offer to purchase the adjacent parcel to the precinct, not the building itself, which was city-owned, but a strip of commercial property that sat between the station and a neighborhood playground. The offer was lawful, public, and disclosed to the city's negotiators. It came with strings. Proposals for joint programs, offers to fund community policing alternatives, and an invitation for the city to negotiate a shared ownership model that would situate civilian oversight physically, where the police presence had long dominated. The city did not accept at first. The mayor's office responded with guarded interest, the language of careful consideration. The chief issued a statement about operational needs. The union called the move a publicity stunt. But public pressure increased. In a town hall on the fourth night after the arrest, a mother stood up and asked the mayor whether her son would ever be safe on a random night. News cameras chronicled the question. The mayor's face tightened. The mayor's advisers whispered about the council. City politics turned like weather. Inside the precinct, Braddock's actions began to be reread as pattern instead of anecdote. Internal affairs, now under a bright light, moved to investigate complaints that had previously been catalogued and shelved. Detective Reynolds pulled prior reports. He found a trail. Complaints about Braddock's rough stops, notes of aggressive tactics, a pattern of escalations that, when placed beside Malik's video, formed a damning arc. Reynolds emailed his supervisor a list and for the first time included a suggestion that they consider restraining the officer pending the investigation. The supervisor pushed back. The union pushed louder. Malik watched the city unveil its processes, a review, a press release, an administrative hearing promised down the line. People said the word due process as if it could be a blanket that covered every wound. He knew the ropes. He also knew that due process could be a tool of delay, a polite way of burying consequences in procedure. However, the combination of legal muscle and civic positioning began to have teeth. A council member Malik had supported in the last election called for a review of police occupancy on city property and asked for a special committee to study alternatives for precinct locations in low-income neighborhoods. A moderator on a local talk show, who had once interviewed Malik about urban renewal, invited him on to state his case. He accepted. When he sat under studio lights and spoke to the city, he framed his argument, not as personal vendetta, but as a civic plan. He spoke about how the building could be repurposed into a community-led hub that housed independent oversight, offered restorative justice programming, and created an interface where residents could hold the department accountable. He spoke about the psychological geography of policing, how the placement of a uniformed building in the middle of a neighborhood can be both protective and oppressive depending on who sets policy. Cameras caught the inflection in his voice, clarity married to steady resolve. The clip from that interview ran side by side with the clip of his arrest. Their juxtaposition formed a narrative track. Victim turned agent. Humiliation turned into civic strategy. The public's appetite for an outcome hardened. People began to ask whether a millionaire's money could be used for moral ends. The answer for many was yes. Not everyone saw it that way. The officer's defenders called his actions lawful and routine, using legal language to inoculate behavior against moral scrutiny. But legalism could not blunt optics forever. The evidence, the timing, the tone, the casual performance of authority, sat in the cool light of a clip looped across platforms. For the first time that week, public pressure met municipal machinery in a way that might force action. Late one night, Malik stood under the awning where the stop had occurred. Rain was a thin sheet. The street smelled of wet asphalt and fried food from a late-night vendor. He watched a patrol car idling nearby, 2 officers inside drinking coffee. He felt the city around him as a living thing that could be nudged, not crushed. He thought of his mother, who had raised him in a house no larger than this awning, and taught him that dignity is a currency that doesn't diminish when you spend it to help someone else. "You think buying the block will work?" Sarah had asked him on their last call. Her voice was careful, her mind catalogued risks. "It will make them choose," he answered simply. "That's power. Not to humiliate, but to make a choice." He stared up at the precinct's brick face, where the department's nameplate read neutral letters. He imagined the nameplate replaced by a sign with different language, Community Accountability Center, and under it, smaller letters that read, Managed by a civilian trust in partnership with the city. He imagined a building that held both the memory of the stop and an apparatus designed to prevent future stops like it. And then the first concrete move was made. A letter arrived at City Hall, an offer to purchase the adjacent parcel with an attached proposal for a public-private partnership. The offer was drafted cleanly, with a clause for community programming and oversight provisions. It was, on paper, a civic invitation. On the other side of town, Braddock's world tightened. He found himself under administrative review, reassigned to desk duty pending the investigation. His badge, once a talisman, now felt like a hot metal that could burn his future. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he had done his job, but the video did not lie about tone. The video, now in an unblinking public forum, told a different story. Malik's action had made something else visible, the thin seam between private capital and public accountability. He had access to a set of tools most citizens don't. He had influence, legal counsel, and the civic standing to move markets. Could money create justice? Not by itself, but money can create options. Options that, when used with rigor and community accountability, can compel institutions to change. The phases that followed were procedural and public. The city opened a review. A hearing was scheduled, nominally to investigate the department's handling of Malik's arrest. Beneath it, there would be negotiations about the parcel. Council meetings swelled with attendance from residents who had been attending for years in hopes of being heard. Malik did not turn these crowds into a spectacle. He spoke at one meeting and left the rest to the process he'd set in motion: legal filings, preservation notices, and strategic property negotiations. As the public momentum grew, the officer's personal life began to fray. He found fewer allies in the precinct corridors. Officers who had once nodded at his swagger now kept their distance. An old complaint file that had lain dormant showed up in an internal binder. An administrative hearing was scheduled to consider his conduct. The union prepared for a defense, but union arguments are predictable and rehearsed. The public appetite for accountability is not. The difference matters in a city where elections turn on perceived leadership and where a mayor calculates political costs against crises. Yet Malik remained cautious. He had seen how easily a story could be co-opted, how a righteous beginning could lead to Pyrrhic outcomes. He did not want a knockout blow to an individual that would leave a system unchanged. He wanted structural shifts, contracts that required independent auditors, oversight boards with teeth, funds invested in youth programs to reduce the reasons policing becomes a nightly spectacle. He wanted a mechanism that channeled his resources into a durable civic design. He began drafting the documents with Sarah and his philanthropic directors, a trust charter that stipulated community majority governance, transparency operations, and funding mechanisms for restorative justice programs. He weighed the legal constraints, municipal property clauses, state statutes about public asset transfers, and union contracts that could complicate a relocation, and adjusted. Each clause tightened the plan into a public instrument. This was the sort of patience he had cultivated in business, building frameworks that other parties could not easily oppose without appearing to oppose the community itself. Around him the narrative thickened. The mayor convened a press conference promising an impartial review. The Police Federation released a generic defense. A local columnist asked whether the idea of buying a precinct was performative or visionary. Some neighbors hesitated. They worried about the optics of a wealthy man reshaping a public good. Malik, who had grown up learning the discipline of listening, spent long afternoons at the corner barbershop answering questions, not in statements, but in conversations. He listened. He adjusted. And then there was a day when he walked into the precinct office, not as an arrestee but as a man with an offer. He asked for the right person to speak to about the parcel sale. The clerk at the window peered through the glass. The world of uniforms treated his new entrance as a different kind of anomaly. He left an envelope with his team's contact information, a formal expression of intent. The envelope's presence was ceremonial and precise. It put his moves on the municipal timeline. That evening, as news vans rotated their lights on the wet asphalt outside the station, Malik stood under the same awning where he'd been pulled from his car days before. He watched the precinct glow under sodium lamps, the same way a building seems to possess a pulse if you stand close enough. He thought about how institutions become comfortable with their footprints, how a building can hold a history of decisions as if they were mortar. His plan would not erase the past, but it would demand the city face the consequences of it. Rain turned to a steady mist. He pulled his coat tighter, and felt the simple human weight of the moment. Humiliation had become a lever. The night had shifted from personal insult to civic opportunity. He had the means to propose a new public architecture. He had the ability to force a political conversation. He would need allies. He would need evidence more than a single clip. He would need patience, law, and a public appetite that would not be sated by mere statements. He would also, crucially, need to ensure that whatever he created would be owned by the community, and not simply another partnership that carried the same power dynamics. As his team prepared the first drafts of the purchase offer and the trust charter, he felt something he hadn't felt in a while. A quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have turned pain into purpose. He thought of the kids at the community center, of the man sitting in the cell who had told him he didn't belong there, of the officer whose assumption had set the whole thing in motion. He thought of the work that remained. The next morning, a headline asked the city a blunt question. Can a man buy accountability? The headline was a provocation, but it also contained the seed of a debate that would occupy City Hall for weeks. Inside the precinct, Officer Braddock sat in a small evidence room filling out forms, his pen moving with the habitual ease of bureaucratic defense. He had always believed in the simple line between order and disorder, and he had practiced the rituals that maintain that line. Now the rituals were being questioned. The smell that had been his probable cause was turning out to be a narrative fault line. Malik's offer to purchase the adjacent property had been filed. It was lawful, public, and uncompromisingly straightforward. A purchase contingent upon a negotiated framework for community oversight. He had instructed his team to be transparent because he knew that secrecy would invite suspicion. He wanted the city council to debate the proposal openly in a room filled with residents who had long wanted a seat at the table. That was where the story stood as the public looked on. An arrest had become a movement. A clip had become an instrument. A city was about to choose between preserving an old posture or making a new bargain with the neighborhood. The momentum he had created would force decisions that the usual political calculus would prefer to defer. And in those hours, between press releases, between the mayor's measured language and the union's boilerplate, Malik found the real work, the drafting of a future that required him to spend what he had earned, not as an indulgence, but as an obligation. He had decided that money, wielded carefully, could bend institutional inertia toward accountability. He did not yet know whether the city would accept his proposal, whether the union would fight or give ground, whether Braddock would be disciplined criminally or merely reassigned. He did not know whether a judge would eventually have to rule on a claim filed in his name, or whether a jury would ever be asked to deliberate about the night. What he knew with the clarity of a man who had spent his life making plans executable was that the next move would take place not just in a courtroom, but on a parcel of brick and concrete where the city had to choose what it wanted from its own conscience. That choice would not be immediate. It would be fought over, negotiated, and mediated by lawyers and voters, and people who kept the city's moral ledger. For now, Malik folded his coat around him in the mist and let the rain collect along the brim of his hat, each drop a small persistent insistence that would not be shrugged off. If you want more stories like this, stories where accountability meets strategy, hit subscribe. Stay with this one, it's just getting started. The council chamber smelled of coffee and old air conditioning. A room that had heard 100 arguments and still sounded reverent when someone spoke for the neighborhood. Bright lights made the dais look like an altar. People filled the seats, neighbors who had shown up for years. A handful of city staffers in neutral suits, a smattering of reporters with notebooks, and then the visible cluster of Malik's team, Sarah, a small cadre of community leaders, and his philanthropy director who kept his phone open for updates. When Malik stood, the room tightened. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. He began exactly where the city had to arrive, with a description of why the placement of power matters. He spoke in the cadence of someone comfortable making complex things simple. He described the night without venom, the rain, the handcuffs, the smell that became probable cause in an officer's imagination. Then he laid out the plan, his offer. A lawful purchase of the parcels that framed the precinct, a transparent trust charter that would fund a community accountability center, and a conditional proposal for the city to relocate active policing functions if the joint plan for oversight and restorative services was adopted. "You can keep the badge," he said quietly, "but the building should belong to those it serves. If the city will not give us the reforms we need, then we will create a new space where oversight is not an afterthought. We will buy the block. We'll fund independent auditors. We'll offer programs that reduce encounters. We'll build a bridge, not a barricade." A council member Malik had helped elect cleared his throat and asked a practical question about the logistics. How much? What statutes controlled the transfer of public property? Would the trust require a municipal vote? Sarah answered with the criminal lawyer's precision and the civic lawyer's patience. Lists of conditions, timelines for public hearings, proposed language for deed restrictions granting civilian review powers, and an offer to underwrite a feasibility study paid for by Malik's foundation to be completed within 90 days. Everything was open, everything public. There was a chorus of objections, some procedural, some visceral. The police union's representative, Sergeant Kowalski, spoke with the union's familiar defensive rhythm. "Protect our people. Don't let a viral clip rewrite every nuance of policing." "If you sell municipal property to a private interest for political purposes," he warned, "what precedent does that set?" He warned about operational readiness, about patrol routes and response times. The chief echoed the need for deliberation. The mayor wanted to look statesmanlike, concerned, consultative, slow to act. But the public had momentum. Mothers and fathers spoke in turns, and their testimonies were not abstract. They were specific. An off-duty uncle who had been frisked jogging home, a teenager who learned the first lesson of mistrust because of a uniformed presence at his school, a grandmother who said she had always felt watched more than protected. Their voices were a ledger of small harms that suddenly felt large by accumulation. At a packed community forum 3 nights later, Malik did not dominate the podium. He listened. He answered. When someone fretted about the optics of a wealthy man buying civic land, he shrugged and said, "I understand the fear, but I'm not buying the precinct to erase public responsibility. I'm using my resources to create a place where responsibility is accountable. If you want to oppose that idea, come with alternatives. Tell us how you'll propose civilian control that doesn't just hand power to the city." The pressure shifted from merely symbolic to procedural. The legal avenues Sarah had opened, preservation orders, public records demands, the civil suit dangle, were already working. The city could choose to negotiate or to litigate. Litigation would be slow, noisy, and politically costly. Negotiation offered a path where the city could salvage its reputation while keeping institutional integrity. Malik made negotiation easier by putting his offer where it could not be ignored. He publicly filed a bid for the adjacent parcels, attached a transparent trust charter, and pledged funding for a feasibility study on relocating active police operations to a modern consolidated facility outside the immediate residential block. The Trust's charter spelled out civilian majority governance, independent auditors, binding transparency measures, and a hotline with subpoena powers for oversight inquiries, a setup that municipal lawyers could not dismiss as pure theatre. Detective Reynolds continued to work his file like a surgeon clearing a clot. He traced Braddock's paper trail, stops, citations, memos that seemed routine until placed beside one another. A complaint here, an internal note there, a citizen's email that had been archived. When Reynolds requested Braddock's prior dashcam footage, something unexpected happened. 3 older clips surfaced, short, rough recordings that exhibited the same performative sniff, the same casual escalation. One was a traffic stop that had not led to charges, but had left a man humiliated. Another was a bump and search that had been log closed. Each clip, by itself, was uneasy. Together, they suggested a pattern. Reynolds' file moved up the chain. Internal Affairs recommended administrative restraint pending investigation. The department, mindful of the public glare, placed Braddock on an administrative desk assignment and recommended disciplinary proceedings. The union pushed back with the predictable language of due process, but the public was watching the process itself now. To talk about due process as if it were an automatic shield felt hollow beside unedited footage. Sarah filed a civil complaint on Malik's behalf alleging false arrest and violation of civil rights, and she included a demand for a jury trial. The complaint asked for damages, but its strategic core was transparency. Discovery would be public, and depositions would pull back institutional curtains. Meanwhile, Malik's team continued the negotiations over the parcel with unembarrassed patience. They made a public offer to the city. Help us build an oversight center, and we will fund the transition costs to relocate the precinct's active duty functions to a facility more suited to modern policing, one with better infrastructure, better community access, and oversight baked into its operations. If the city refused, Malik's fund still intended to purchase the block and create a civic campus that would make the precinct's footprint politically uncomfortable. The union threatened litigation to block any sale. An old municipal statute made selling city property complex. There would be hearings, votes, and potential legal challenges. The mayor convened a special committee to study the proposal. The committee's first hearing was grand theatre. Testimony, legal briefs, public comments. Sarah glided through the tricky legal terrain, municipal procurement law, public notice requirements, the necessary resolution by the council. The proposal was not a takeover. It was a negotiated public-private partnership that respected municipal processes while constructing a civic commons. Then the legal theatre moved to the more dangerous arena: sworn testimony. The civil depositions were where the narrative sharpened. Braddock sat under a lawyer's glare and tried to keep the cadence he used on the beat, a confident, decisive officer. But video doesn't care for cadence. Clayton Hayes, the county prosecutor who had watched the unfolding story carefully, had decided to review the criminal angle. He convened prosecutors, and after reviewing the dashcam footage, comparing it with Braddock's incident report, and consulting with internal affairs, he determined there was probable cause to pursue charges for filing a false report and for evidence tampering, charges that, if proved, could carry criminal consequences. Clayton spoke in the precise cadence of someone who understood both political pressure and evidentiary limits. "We pursue what the evidence supports," he told reporters. "We will let the grand jury decide." At the civil deposition, Braddock's statements began to fray. Sarah's cross-examination was surgical. She had the timeline, dashcam audio, the bystanders' footage, the timestamps on radio logs. She asked direct questions about the smelling allegation. Braddock repeated it as he had before, claiming he detected the odor of marijuana. Then Sarah displayed the audio, slowed it down, and asked him to describe whether he had smelled anything before leaning into the car or after. The pause was small, but for everyone watching it, widened into a chasm. Under oath, he wavered. His report said one thing. The footage suggested another cadence, performance rather than discovery. Ben O'Malley's deposition shocked the room. The younger officer, who had been present at the stop and who had quietly sent Malik a nod while Malik was being led away, had something to say. Ben had joined the force with faith in the badge, but with an uneasy conscience. Facing the camera and the lawyers, Ben told the truth the way young officers sometimes do, when they realize the weight of a lie will fall heavier on their future than a moment of candor. He described Braddock's demeanor, the theatrics of the sniff, the way Braddock had framed the stop before an objective smell could have been confirmed. In a single line, Ben said what everyone could feel. It felt like he was looking for a reason, not finding one. His testimony echoed in the quiet of the room. That testimony alone did not convict anyone. But combined with the pattern found by Reynolds and the unedited footage played in deposition, the case against Braddock moved from anecdote to a prosecutable narrative. The grand jury convened. Clayton presented exhibits, incident reports, dashcam footage, the cell phone clip, prior complaint files, and the recorded statements. He drew a through line, an officer's report that deviated materially from a recorded interaction, a pattern of similar stops where the use of authority seemed to outpace probable cause. The grand jury returned an indictment on counts alleging falsifying a police report and civil rights violations, a dramatic escalation that sounded in the paper like consequence and felt in the precinct like a rupture. News trucks clustered at the precinct steps the day the indictment was announced. Braddock, who had once relished the attention his uniform brought, stood in an underlit corridor and watched the world outside his badge. He was formally charged and suspended, without pay pending trial. The union moved to defend him, but quietly also sought to limit collateral damage. There were legal briefs filed, motions to suppress certain evidence, and an appeal to the administration's desire for institution-preserving compromise. The legal fights were dense and technical, but to the public they translated into a simpler math. The officer was no longer simply a man on the beat. He was at the center of a public reckoning. The civil case moved forward in the courtroom at the same time negotiations about the parcel proceeded. Malik's team had not wanted to weaponize his resources for spectacle, but the leverage had been effective. A city council vote put Malik's proposal on the docket: authorize a memorandum of understanding to explore the parcel's sale, authorize the formation of a community trust with funding commitments to convert the block, start a public process for relocating the precinct. The vote was close. Political calculations moved on the margins, but the optics of a man from the neighborhood, backed by both law and public sentiment, made resistance politically costly. In closed sessions, settlement discussions took shape. The city, weighing protracted litigation against political catastrophe, proposed a compromise. The city would accept Malik's purchase of the adjacent parcels. It would enter into a public-private partnership with the trust that would fund a comprehensive community accountability center on the combined property, complete with binding oversight mechanisms and a guaranteed timeline for relocating certain active police functions to a modern facility elsewhere. The city would support funding for the new facility in exchange for co-locating certain administrative services. As part of the settlement, the city would agree to retain the option to relocate the precinct and to engage in a 2-year audit overseen by civilian reviewers with subpoena powers. The agreement would be subject to council approval and community hearings. It was not everything Malik wanted. It was, however, more than the city would have offered before the viral clip rewired public appetite. It was a negotiated transformation. The precinct would not vanish overnight, but the footprint of policing in that block would be altered by design, not default. The trust would own a contiguous field of ground that included community spaces, the oversight office, and a restorative justice wing. The deed would contain enforceable transparency covenants, published use of force data, independent audits, civilian complaint outcomes, and guaranteed funding for youth programs. At the same time, the criminal case against Braddock marched forward. In pre-trial hearings, prosecutors laid out the evidence of reporting inconsistencies and the appearance of impropriety. Braddock's defense argued that the rush to judgment had been fueled by public pressure and that good faith errors do not equate to criminal falsification. The trial itself was a slow-moving machine of procedure. Clayton prosecuted with a steady, unsensational cadence designed to let the evidence breathe. Sarah, though representing Malik in the civil action, did not prosecute. Her role remained focused on ensuring the civil discovery continued to shine a light. The criminal trial was the state's matter, and Clayton treated it with caution. The courtroom, when the dashcam footage played in open court, was both ordinary and electric. Jurors sat in rows, sometimes glancing at one another like people who had been asked to be guardians of a moral ledger. The footage, unedited, time-stamped, raw, showed Braddock leaning into the window, the sniff that seemed more performative than investigative. Malik's measured words, his hands placed on the hood, the cuffing, the removal. The prosecutor placed the officer's incident report beside the footage and contrasted the language. Certain observations were stated as facts in the report that on film appeared as impressions or theatrical gestures. Under cross-examination in front of the jury, Braddock's composure cracked slightly. He was not a man who had ever imagined being in the dock. He had disciplined questions about his training and his recollections, how he had come to assert there was a scent, whether he had documented any prior complaints he had made, whether he had checked for other corroborating evidence before arresting Mr. Carter. Ben O'Malley, called as a witness by the prosecution, testified about his perspective at the stop. Ben's testimony was quiet and precise. He had not smelled anything himself. He had seen his partner approach the stop in a way that suggested an intent to escalate. Ben's words landed heavy in the courtroom. At one point, Clayton asked a straightforward question that cut through legalese. "Officer Braddock, Why did you write in your report that you detected an odor of marijuana if the footage shows you leaning in and sniffing theatrically? Braddock hesitated. He reached for a framing that would preserve his authority. I believed I smelled it. Belief is not evidence, Clayton replied. The line was judicial in tone, and it made the room lean. It was a prosecutorial moment that did not gloat. It merely demanded standards. The trial's outcome was not immediate. The jury deliberated. In the end, the jury returned a mixed verdict, finding him guilty on an administrative count related to falsifying a report and recommending disciplinary removal from the force. On the criminal counts, the jury deadlocked on certain elements that required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The result was messy. There was accountability, an administrative termination from the department, and internal recommendations for policy reform. There was not the criminal conviction many in the public had hoped for, but the civil consequences soon hardened the result. The civil trial that followed, brought by Malik for violation of rights and damages, did what public pressure often does. It fills in where criminal law's higher burden leaves a gap. The jury in the civil case found that Malik's rights had been violated and awarded damages, both compensatory and punitive, reflecting the gravity of the conduct. The city settled portions of the case and agreed to the trust governance plan as part of the broader settlement, partly to avoid prolonged litigation and partly because the settlement offered a path toward structural change. Braddock, already fired, faced a professional end. His law enforcement certification was revoked pending administrative review by the state agency. His pension application, under scrutiny, met statutory hurdles. The administrative process began to claw back benefits, where a finding of misconduct met legal standards for forfeiture. He was not held up as a villain to be laughed at. He was, rather, an officer whose career ended beneath the weight of institutional scrutiny and public consequence. Throughout, Malik remained careful about the distinction between accountability and revenge. He publicly expressed no pleasure at Braddock's ruin. He framed his actions as civic repair. In interviews, he said he wanted the city to prove it could be better, to show that a community could help shape the institutions that served it. This is not about one man, he told a television anchor. It's about how we govern trust. It's about making sure a single person cannot convert policing into performance. With the legal battles beginning to fade, the real work of building a new civic presence began. The trust purchased the adjoining parcels in a transparent transaction. The deed carried the covenants Malik insisted upon. The Independent Audit Office, a community majority board, guaranteed funding for restorative programs, and an open data set for policing metrics. The trust published minutes. Community members were invited into governing roles. Malik stepped back from daily decisions. He had put resources into the structure, but insisted the structure be rooted in the people who lived there. The precinct, as negotiated, did not vanish. The city built a plan to consolidate certain active duty functions in a modern facility in the municipal complex 3 miles away. The new location was designed to have better training spaces and community liaison offices. The neighborhood regained the block as a civic campus, part oversight, part restorative justice center, part youth programming hub. The precinct's signage was taken down one rainy morning and replaced with a temporary banner announcing plans for the Community Accountability and Healing Center. There was no triumphal tearing down. There was a ribbon cutting months later, with Malik standing among neighbors and residents who had helped design the program. Inside the new center, auditors posted findings publicly. Civilian review panels were granted subpoena powers calibrated by statute. They could compel testimony from officers for internal disciplinary reviews. The trust funded mediation for minor encounters, invested in mental health response teams to handle non-criminal calls, and created a scholarship program that honored the victims of unjust stops. Police leadership participated in the co-management process, reluctant at first, then gradually collaborative as the metrics showed reductions in escalated calls and improved community trust indices in certain program areas. What happened to Braddock had a human dimension that Malik watched with a complicated empathy. The officer's marriage strained under the weight of career collapse. He moved into a small apartment and took odd jobs. He enrolled in counseling, and he occasionally sent letters to the state agency contesting the process. The punitive side of the story was visible: job loss, reputational ruin, but he was not humiliated for entertainment. The narrative, if anything, was a cautionary tale about the cost of unexamined assumptions. Ben O'Malley remained on the force for a time, his conscience tested by what he had witnessed and what he had done. He transferred to a training unit that focused on de-escalation and implicit bias, and Malik's program funded a training fellowship that allowed young officers to study community relations in exchange for service in community policing roles. Ben's path became part of the reform story, an example of how individuals can change institutions from within when incentives and accountability align. Detective Reynolds continued his work, now lauded quietly for having followed the evidence rather than the status quo. He spearheaded an internal review unit that collaborated with the Trust's auditors. He did not become a public hero so much as a functional one, an institutional reformer in uniform who understood that the routines of policing needed periodic renovation. There were skeptics. Some residents worried about the Trust's longevity. Others questioned whether a private fund could be an appropriate custodian for public accountability. Malik knew these critiques and built safeguards: endowment funds that could not be easily redirected, community ballot measures for major structural changes, transparency portals that allowed anyone to see financial flows. Those measures were not perfect, but they were deliberate. He wanted the program to outlast him. Years later, the block looked different. The brick face of the old precinct entombed plaques about community meetings, restorative justice workshops, and an archive of civic audits. Teenagers played under lights paid for by a program set up under the Trust. A breakfast program for neighbors in crisis had a whiteboard listing volunteers. Police cars still rolled by, but their presence felt less like authority rehearsing and more like one actor among many in a civic ecology. Data showed fewer escalated encounters in the immediate area. Complaints that used to be common found new resolution channels. Malik returned sometimes to the awning where he'd been pulled from his car. He would stand in the rain and look at the new sign: Community Accountability and Healing Center. It was not a monument to his victory, but a reminder that a moment could be turned into an architecture of change. He thought often of the man in the cell named Cassidy, of the mothers at council, of the young officer who had told the truth. He did not forget Braddock. He watched the man adjust to a life outside the badge, and sometimes wondered if the officer's own patterns might have shifted, if examined earlier. In the quiet hours, he reflected on what momentum had required: legal acumen, public pressure, patient negotiation, and the translation of personal resources into structural levers. The story was not that money solved everything, far from it. The story was that money, when married to law and community accountability, can create options that compel institutions to choose a different path. One rainy evening, standing where the sodium light still painted the street with its familiar glow, Malik watched the center's evening class dismiss. Children ran past with their jackets flapping like small flags. A woman he had helped years ago crossed the street and called his name. They exchanged nothing heavy: a nod, a thank you, a small smile. It was enough. He had turned humiliation into civic instrument. He had not gorged on another's fall. He had instead worked through procedure and pressure to make an old footprint into a new possibility. The precinct's sign dangled in his mind like a memory. It had been replaced by a sign that read, simply, plainly, that something had been repurposed for the community. If accountability is the oxygen of a functioning democracy, Malik thought, then our job is to keep the air clean. Institutions can be corrected when people insist, when evidence is allowed to speak, and when resources are used to build durable alternatives rather than temporary spectacle. The rain tapered. A child laughed. The center's lights hummed. If this story matters to you, if you believe accountability should be paired with action, like the video, subscribe, and share this with someone who cares about justice and reform.